Thank you so much for joining us at Spotlight. I just finished reading your book, The Cycle, and I really felt seen. The way you described your personal experiences with PMDD really resonated with how I felt for a big part of my life and how I felt that no one else around me could relate to. Like, I felt like how I was describing my emotions and those really crazy mood swings. And people were like, "Oh, are you sure you're not just bipolar or that you don't have a mental health disorder or something like that?" For those who haven't read your book or who aren't aware, could you give a short description of your journey?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm so glad that it resonated. And I'm sorry that it's been such a struggle. I was inspired to write my book about PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric disorder, a form of very severe PMS where people have severe psychiatric symptoms right before their period or during their period, which means anger, rage, depression, and it influences your ability to function. And what was happening is for several years, I was having really horrible fights with my partner. And I had no idea why, because normally I'm even keeled, I'm conflict averse. And then all of a sudden I would just blow up. When I was 30, I got diagnosed with premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And my first question was, why have I never heard about this? Why did it take so long? And this book started as an investigation into that question.
Wow, thanks a lot for the overview. You mentioned in your book that PMDD can cost people nearly 4 years of productivity during their reproductive years, right? So, as someone in a high pressure, deadline driven job as a journalist, reporter, and a writer, how did you personally navigate this reality? And what would you say to others trying to manage the same kind of tension?
I've been thinking a lot about this question. And one thing I hesitate to do is I don't want people to think that people with PMDD are less capable or if they do less work. At the same time, I don't want to make light of how much it does impact people. So I kind of want to break it down into two parts, which is number one, if you add up the number of days that people are impacted, it's a huge cost, right? And I think what ends up happening for people who are ambitious, who love their jobs and who want to succeed is you overcompensate because you don't want anyone to know because there's so much discrimination that women face at work and particularly in competitive fields. And so what ends up happening is you work extra hours when you can. So anytime that I had extra energy, and the flip side of PMDD is I have 2 weeks where I'm full of energy and I'm like, I'm superhuman. I can work out twice a day. I can work 12-hour days, 14-hour days. And then so I do. On the one hand, sometimes I think about it like, oh my gosh, if I could work 14 to 16-hour days all day, every day for the whole month, look at where I'd be. I'd rule the world. On the other hand, I honestly think I'd probably have a breakdown. And in some ways, I think of PMDD as a slowing mechanism, as time to take a pause and something that's kept me from burning myself out.
Well, that's a nice way to flip it indeed, to see it as, okay, my body's just telling me to take things easy, otherwise symptoms will flare up.
I mean, we didn't have a choice about PMDD, so I try to find the silver linings wherever I can.
Yeah, that's a nice perspective. Speaking of stigma, right, and discrimination, in your book, you say that a sociologist said PMDD isn't actually real, it's undiagnosed depression or anxiety, and that some people might just, blame their hormones to avoid that label of you have a mental health disorder. But you said periods are even more stigmatized than mental health disorders in a lot of society. Can you talk a little bit more about that disconnect and what that says about how society views women's health?
Yeah, I actually feel like I would be much more comfortable saying I wrote a book about depression or anxiety. I've been in a situation, I was at a writer's conference in an elevator full of men, and they noticed, oh, you're a speaker here, you're a writer. What did you write about? And I just said, well, PMDD. What is that? It's a menstrual health disorder. And I explain what it is and right before your period. The entire elevator goes quiet. And I'm just like, unfortunately, there's no way to get out of this elevator. I'm stuck here until the doors open. I don't think there would have been as much stigma if it had just been a mental health disorder, or at least there would have been more of a chance of somebody in the elevator being like, oh, me too. Well, perhaps not because it's still stigmatized. But I do feel there's an element of gender here. We could have a whole separate talk about how women have been discriminated against, how our ailments are understudied, and how almost anything has been used against us.
Yeah. And how medication has mainly been tested on male bodies.
Exactly.
Well, speaking of medication, you were initially prescribed gas, the birth control pill, for PMDD, but it actually worsened your mood swings. I personally experienced the exact same thing. So I had an IUD placed as birth control, and then the GP said, how about you take the birth control pill to stabilize your cycle, and let's see what that does. That didn't work out. So it got really, really bad. Why do you think there's such a gap between what PMDD experts and people who really are really knowledgeable about this and what people actually experience when they go to their healthcare providers? What needs to change to bridge this gap?
First of all, I am so sorry that that happened to you. I have met people where Yaz did work, so I don't want to just throw Yaz under the bus. It is a great treatment for some people, but also for those of us where it's not, just solidarity, having been in the same boat. Not many people know about PMDD. I still go to health providers, and there's about a 50% chance if I say I've got PMDD, somebody will say, what is that? I haven't heard about it. And I've gotten very proactive about just explaining it ahead of time. And so if you're at that basic level of trying to explain it to your healthcare provider, of course, they're not going to necessarily be an expert on it. I had a doctor, like my GP, who I love, wonderful person. He was like, you know what? You probably know more about PMDD than I do. Why don't you tell me what's been working for you, what hasn't? Let's sit down and have a dialogue and figure this out together. And what a gem of a human being, right? Like he's making it a dialogue. He's admitting what he doesn't know. But at the same time, that's kind of a best case where a lot of people, I've interviewed a lot of people where their PMDD, they've had people say that doesn't exist. You're making it up. And so it's just not well known. And if you actually think about where we are in terms of women's health, PMDD is one of a slate of many different things. And if you think about how many things a medical student has to study and what we prioritize, I was talking to a gynecologist friend who was just like, honestly, I should probably be asking more people about their mental health symptoms. But she's like, when somebody comes in for a checkup, there's so many things I'm going through. And because she was specializing in pregnancy and keeping people alive, her questions were like, is the mom going to be okay? Is the baby going to be okay? And PMDD was really not high up on her radar. And she was like, it's maybe 5% of the people I see.
Mm. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I also had a conversation with a few other people, 2 researchers and 1 clinical psychologist with experience with treating PMDD. They all mentioned this neglect of the menstrual cycle in so many cases. When presented with symptoms that could be linked to PMDD, the question doesn't even get asked, is this coming back regularly? How often do you feel this way? And could this be cyclical? I think that's the very core of where it would start, because I think the questions that are asked in a standard way, like where does it hurt? How do your symptoms manifest and so on? But then to really build in that kind of, okay, if this is someone who menstruates, maybe ask about their cycle.
It's such a good point because I think the question is broader than just PMDD. We don't talk about periods because it's stigmatized. So we're not really even aware of how many different things they impact. And it's hard when something is cyclical to necessarily keep that data, to recognize when is this happening, which is why it took me so long to figure out. And then the menstrual cycle is also tied to so many other things. It's not just PMDD, it exacerbates anxiety, depression. When I was researching my book, one of my friends who has depression and is diagnosed with it was suddenly like, oh my God, I realized each of my really awful episodes came right before my period. And she also has a very irregular period. So that makes it even harder to figure out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And the researchers I talked to mentioned sleep studies. You could factor in the menstrual cycle into that. Eating disorders, even how those are linked, neurodivergence, there's just so much, because it's such a big part of our biology that it basically impacts everything. So I think that's quite an exciting area that they're going to start moving into slowly.
100%. I can't wait to see what researchers will come up with.
Yeah. Speaking of medication and treatment, you speak in your book a lot about the side effects, like, suppressed libido and emotional instability, like with yes, for example. What's your view on the trade-off between symptom management and overall well-being? Because that was also what my GP struggled with. She said, well, is it worth it for you? If you're going to take antidepressants, for example, and you're going to get a lot of side effects, is that worth having fewer symptoms or not? How do you see that?
I think that's a really personal decision that each individual has to make. And I don't think anyone else can make that for you because you're the one living through the symptoms. But depending on your personal life circumstances and goals, that may affect what you're willing to tolerate and what you're not willing to tolerate. In terms of side effects, it's personal preference. I think we each pick our individual life paths based on what is the price we're willing to pay for something. I really would hesitate to tell someone do this or don't do that because I'm not walking in their shoes.
Mm, that's a great perspective. Indeed. I was also fascinated by the conversation you had about the three subtypes of PMDD, essentially a sensitivity to a surge of either progesterone or estrogen or the estrogen withdrawal. How might naming and recognizing these subtypes officially change our conversation about PMDD?
I think it'll deepen it. And, going back to your question about the gap in terms of what the expert knows and how are we treating people in terms of clinical care. I was talking to Dr. Tori Eisenlorm, who is one of the researchers behind that paper coming up with the three subtypes. And she compared where we are in terms of PMDD research to where we were with breast cancer in the early 80s. And where she was saying, we knew that breast cancer existed, but we hadn't figured out the different types. And that's where we are with PMDD today, where, as we were talking about, some people will respond really well to yes. You and I did not. We probably have a different kind of sensitivity. Understanding what those different types are, because that theory is still nascent. The research around it, they just came out with a new paper, but it's going to take a lot more studies probably. And there's going to be communicating this and getting it to trickle down into the clinical setting, which to begin with, there's still so many providers who don't even know what PMDD is. So it's going to be a whole nother step to get to. Well, there are different types. How do you recognize those in people and how do we tailor treatment accordingly?
Hmm. Yeah, makes sense. And since you spoke about the research still being nascent and this area still being so muddled and new, it's particularly vulnerable to misinformation and all this wellness fluff and pseudoscience. What do you see as the best way forward? Because not everyone is educated in a scientific, evidence-based view and able to read scientific papers and studies and interpret that data the same way as we are, because we are quite well versed in those things. How can people access credible information without getting into this whole wormhole of conflicting advice?
It's really tough. And you ask a really good question. First of all, there is confusion because even in terms of the research, there are some disagreements. This goes for any disorder. If you get down into the research papers and what the experts believe, there's a certain level of disagreement. And reading academic papers is hard. After writing my book, I started a newsletter to just interview researchers and ask, can you translate your paper into something that I can understand and that lay people can understand? So on the one hand, I really appreciate when social media goes and they start talking about PMDD, when people tell their own story, because I think it just spreads the word in a way that's really accessible. However, I would just encourage people to analyze where they're getting their information from. If you're hearing about PMDD from social media, do more research, figure out what are they quoting, do your own Googling and see, read something from a medical website. That doesn't mean you have to go back to the primary source and read academic papers that don't necessarily make sense, but just make sure that everything is coming from something that is evidence-based and from researchers and experts instead of someone on social media knows maybe just as much as another layperson.
In your book, you touch on something that so many of us experience, because yeah, I've had that so often that people will write off your emotions as just PMDD. In the heat of the moment, in fights with our partners, it's very tricky because it's so easy to then go, oh yeah, you're having PMDD symptoms, or you're just overly emotional right now. So to get dismissed that way, how do you make peace with that blurred line between real feelings and PMDD influenced feelings?
Yeah, I feel really lucky in that I feel like what happens is, my husband, my parents, my friends will say, I was feeling really bad about that. I was like, how do I know anything is real? And they all kind of sat me down. They were like, you've never made anything up. When you're upset, there is a valid reason. The question is your reaction proportional? Is it something that is working to further your goals, or is it just completely self-destructive? That has been really helpful in validating my emotions. What I think of a lot is usually, what sparks it is something that I have let slide. And I tend to be easygoing and conflict averse. And who knows, maybe I'm trying to compensate for these PMDD outbursts. But a lot of times I won't necessarily bring something up, and then it'll build and it'll build and it'll build. And it comes out in the worst way possible with PMDD. And so what I've actually been trying to get better at is bringing something up early when it's upsetting me. And it's a small thing. And then it's easy to just be like, hey, that really bothered me. Can we do something about this? The conversation is so much easier than if you've gone off the cliff and lost it.
One that my partner and I have devised is kind of like, if we're still fighting about this when you're in your good phase, then you're
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You also then write that love looks different in PMDD affected relationships. What does that look like in yours? I mean, you've talked about it, but have you developed any kind of concrete strategies or rituals that help reduce that kind of strain?
I do want to say the biggest thing for me has been medication. And I will say that over and over again. I have also paired it with coping mechanisms. Medication has not been purely enough. It's, again, just getting better at being proactive at communicating and recognizing when I'm about to go off the cliff, or if I'm already off, and just then actually saying it, like, I am PMDDing right now. Like, I am not capable of having a constructive conversation. And also, I think some of it is the people around me letting me have that space. So before I knew I had PMDD, I would often try to push through. Okay, something is really noisy. The noise is driving me up the wall. I don't want to say anything. I don't want to put people out. And then later I have an explosion. Now it's just, can we turn off that blender? I'm about to lose it. Or I'm sorry, I really cannot do XYZ. I am exhausted. I feel like I want to fall asleep every hour or so. And I give myself that space. And it's hard.
Yeah. Yeah, my partner and I talked about, because one of the researchers that I talked to has struggled with PMDD herself, and she gave me this strategy document of a traffic light. Like, you can write down on your green days, amber days, red days, like what you need from other people, which is like a really nice strategy that I want to try out. It's, my partner mentioned getting an actual traffic light, just putting it on the of the day. Which is, I mean, this is a way of wordlessly communicating that you're not in a good state. So I was just picturing that kind of a thing.
I'll send my partner an angry GIF, like a cute one, like if this angry kid, like, and it's sort of, it kind of packages it up. Like, I am really pissed. There's part of me that knows this is fueled by PMDD and that I do love you, but I don't feel good. And kind of being able to communicate that, I think, has really taken the sting out.
Yeah. Humor softens a lot of things, doesn't it?
100%. Yeah, a lot of humor.
On that side of things, you wrote something really beautiful. One of your interviewees said, that maybe there's strength in PMDD. And what does that strength look like for you? Like you mentioned already in the beginning, that it tells you to slow down, not burn out, and go, go, go. Has it actually changed how you see yourself pre-diagnosis versus post?
Yeah, in many ways, I think the diagnosis has helped me make peace with myself. I used to carry a tremendous amount of guilt. And now I try to give myself the space of, I have a chronic condition. I didn't choose to be like this. And again, I don't want to lessen this, because a lot of times I've heard people say, like, this is awful. I don't want to be asked about a silver lining here, because this is a chronic condition. I am suffering. And I don't want people to think that this is, oh, secretly a good thing. Again, I focus on these silver linings because we have no choice. The treatments are imperfect. Even if they're working, there are still times when it's not working well. You might have to change something. There are times when you have to go off and you have to suffer. So, how do you make sense of your suffering? And in that case, I try to think about the gifts, which are it's forced me to get better at conflict resolution, I think, but it's also forced me to advocate for myself because I can't sit on anything that's upsetting me. PMDD will force it out. And in many ways, that's helped me get what I need in relationships, particularly when we live in a patriarchal society where many women are not willing to go through conflict, end up not getting what they want. And I think that could very easily be me, given my complete disinclination for conflict. It's helped me advocate at work because when I've had jobs that I really loved and I feel myself getting PMDD-ish, then I have to really think, okay, I know this thing is going to upset me. It's going to come back every month. What do I need to do to be happy? Because I don't want to leave my job. That's helped me fight for raises in ways that I don't think I would normally just be like, you know what? It's okay to get paid peanuts. I think it's made me more empathic and much more sensitive to other people's pain and more understanding as a person.
That's beautiful. And I feel like we are more self-aware because of all the different emotions going on and also uncontrollable kind of emotions to articulate what exactly is happening within us. I feel we are way better at identifying those kinds of emotions and expressing them than the average person.
And I think you have to get really good at it and at relationship repair because if you want to have friends or relationships and you're having meltdowns like this, you're not going to have them unless you figure out some way to compensate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And on that note, you close the book by hoping that PMDD might one day become a bit like your asthma, which you say you manage, but it's not really something you think about all the time. It's been, I think, over a year since you published the book, hasn't it? Has that hope become more real for you now?
Yeah, I think so. During the process of writing the book, I was still quite new to the diagnosis. And so I was integrating it into my identity. And the book really helped with that process of going through the past, making peace with it. At the same time, it's still tricky when going to the doctors and they don't know what PMDD is, or it's a bit harder to get treatment. So I don't think we're there as a society where it's something as casual as, yeah, I went to urgent care. And when I was there, I figured, I might as well get my inhaler prescription refilled and renewed. And then I'm good to ask for my SSRIs for PMDD. The inhaler, the doctor was like, yeah, no problem. Sure, have all the inhalers you want. SSRIs, it was like the Spanish Inquisition. Like, you want what? I was like, it's just fluoxetine. We're not giving me opioids here. But it was still like, why do you want this? What do you have? Our office didn't prescribe this to you. And I was just like, but you were willing to give me these inhalers, which you didn't prescribe me. What's the difference? It's on my medical record. So I think until that piece of having to advocate and every time you're going to a doctor, you switch, it is going to be kind of present on your mind. And so I think until the medical establishment is comfortable, it is hard to, as an individual, be comfortable.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I had a similar experience. About 5 years ago, I went to see a GP because I felt suspicious about how regularly my moods would change. Normally, I'm quite a balanced person who's very optimistic and just, chill. But, oftentimes that week or 2 weeks, I would not be chill. I thought, let's go there and bring this up and see what they say. The way they reacted when I said, oh, I think maybe antidepressants might help was like, no, medication is really the extreme treatment and you should try everything else before you try medication. Antidepressants are really strong and you should use this at the most in the case where you have nothing else. And it really scared me off. I was like, but is it that bad? Like, is there, I still even felt like there was a sort of stigma to the types of people that took antidepressants or in some way. Like, they were kind of like the unsavable or the untreatable ones. So, yeah, I think even that attitude of like, well, let's talk about it. Let's make a plan together. Maybe we could try it and see if it helps you. That would have been really great if I'd had that option 5 years ago. Instead I was just kind of sent to the in-house counselor who said I should try homeopathy. So I was like, but not gonna take sugar pill. Like, why are you kidding? So that
I'm
was
frustrated that happened to you. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. That's terrible.
yeah. So it's a long ways to go yet.
It's oh my God. And it's just I don't know. I've gotten the whole like, have you tried yoga? Have you tried Advil? And it's like, if I'm at the doctor's, I'm not a little duckling that's hatched from an egg and is like, oh, Advil. Like, what
Yeah.
is that?
Yeah.
We have tried all these things. It's not that you're having breakdowns every month and you're like, fine with that. I'm not going to try anything. Of course, you're trying things. You're going to try every single thing you can think of. You're at the doctor's because nothing has worked. Stories like that, I'm just like, oh, I get so mad.
Great. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for chatting with me. And it was such a pleasure, such wonderful questions.
Thanks.